Today, my task is to open the discussion on the Communist International, as we're celebrating the 100 years of the founding of the Communist International. As I said yesterday, it was really the only truly revolutionary mass international, although the Second International in a certain period had played a similar role, but it developed over a long period and degenerated along reformist lines. Just a little detail on that. The social democracy, the German social democracy, which was considered like the leading party of the Second International, which Lenin looked up to as a model of organization, became truly a massive organization with lots of local papers, big trade unions, etc. That party had within it, you could say almost from the very early days, the seeds of its future degeneration. One of them was when they fused with the Lassallians. And if you read Marx's letters to Engels on this question, Marx was fuming at the leaders of the German comrades of Marx, who basically accepted a watered-down version of the principles of the party in order to achieve fusion, i.e., in order to achieve a numerically bigger organization. They lost the sharpness of principle. And Marx was going to come out against them on that. But then he concluded that once the party had been formed, the mass of workers wouldn't understand such a conflict. And so what he did was to work on the party, advising his followers over a long period of time and educating the party and winning it over to a Marxist position. But from the very early days, you had this element within it, which is, I think, an important element in understanding what later happened. And secondly, as Marxists, we understand that conditions determine consciousness, and the prolonged boom in the late 1800s, the growth of capitalism, etc., the cooperatives, it seemed as if things were getting better under capitalism, and this actually led to an attempt to revise Marxism, i.e., capitalism does not enter into crisis cyclically, but it can be gradually reformed, and socialism can be achieved peacefully and gradually. This is what emerged within the German social democracy and the Second International as a whole. Somebody referred to Rosa Luxemburg's text, The Reform or Revolution, which is an answer to that. So you have a process of a growth of the Second International, but then its degeneration. And at a key moment, I'm not going to go into the details, I've given other lead-offs on this, and we can come back to this, because there's a lot of interesting stuff about what was going on in the Second International, which, if we want to have another period of history which could be compared to that, you'd have to say it was the post-Second World War period, which had the massive boom, really put the seal on the degeneration of the workers' organizations because of the conditions of capitalism, because of the boom. Again, it seemed in the short term that capitalism had solved its problems, and that further strengthened reformism. But as Marxists, we know that the system hadn't changed fundamentally. It went through different periods, through different cycles, but the contradictions remain the same. And periodically, you have these big crises. And the revisionism in the Second International couldn't foretell what happened at the beginning of the 20th century, the crisis, the First World War, and all the revolutions that erupted after that. And again, after the Second World War, it seemed that capitalism had restabilized itself. And in those conditions, it can become difficult to defend the genuine ideas of revolutionary Marxism. In those periods, Marxists are inevitably condemned to being a small minority because the masses are difficult to reach in those conditions. The masses need time and experience of crisis to draw the conclusions the Marxists have. And even the Marxists themselves can be destroyed in such a period. They can draw all kinds of mistaken conclusions, which also explains sectarianism, it explains both phenomena, actually. Reformism and sectarianism are a consequence of such periods. And it's the fortune to say that Trotsky, in that difficult period of the 30s, preserved the genuine ideas of Marxism. And it's true to say that Ted Grant, after the Second World War, really preserved the ideas of Marxism which allow us to exist as a tendency today. But going back to the main item of this lead-off, in August, the 4th of August became a famous term because it was the famous day that the social democracy betrayed the working class openly by voting for the war credits. In all the congresses previous to that of the Second International, in the resolutions, they said they would never allow such a thing to happen. They would never allow a fratricidal war between workers, and that they would struggle to transform the war into civil war in all countries of workers against the capitalists. Instead, they voted for the war credits. Lenin himself couldn't believe it when he first heard it. He just couldn't believe they could have gone so far. But as a result of that, discussions began about the need for a new international. The Bolshevik Central Committee of November 1914, for example, called for a proletarian international. And from that year on, the Bolsheviks began to agitate for the need to build a new international organization. In 1915, you had Zimmerwald with 42 delegates, which were not all revolutionary Marxists. In fact, the Bolsheviks were a minority even within the famous Zimmerwald conference, and they became the Zimmerwald left. In that period of war, it was very difficult to hold together the forces of revolutionary Marxism. It was even physically difficult to actually be in contact with each other because of the war situation. But the end of the war produces first the Russian Revolution in 1917. No need to go into that. I'm sure you've discussed it thoroughly. Followed by the revolution in Germany in November 1918. Then you have the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, torn apart by the events, and revolutionary movements sweep across Europe. It's that you go from the reaction of the First World War to the revolutionary wave across Europe, which I can't go into the details of every single movement that took place. But you have the beginnings, you have the seeds being laid of the future Comintern parties in Germany, in Austria, in Hungary, in Holland, in Poland. And you see left factions developing in other countries within the socialist parties. The parties that gave origin to the Third International, the groups, some of them were sizable groups, parties you could say, others were small groups, small nuclei, but they were struggling to build this new organization. Now, March 1919 is when they found officially the Third International. 51 delegates from 22 countries. So it was actually a smaller meeting than this in terms of numbers, but in terms of what they represented, of course, far bigger. It was a 4-day conference in Moscow, and generally speaking, small parties and inexperienced parties. This is one of the problems which you will see throughout the subsequent years. Well, in 1919, they even doubted whether they should launch the Third International. Remember, Rosa Luxemburg was against the launching of the Third, not because she was against the launching of a new international, but because she felt it was premature, needed time to win over more people. It was a tactical difference. But in the course of the debate itself, the delegates were convinced that they should, in fact, launch the Third International, send out a beacon of hope to the workers of the world. By 1921, just within 2 years, the International had spread to all the continents and had hundreds of thousands of members. And then they held the next, the 4 congresses, from the first to the 4th, were congresses which we as an organization claim as ours. We take on board all the theses and conclusions of those 4 congresses that were genuine congresses of revolutionary communists. Now, the Russian Revolution is what gave the impetus, and the wave of revolution is what gave it the conditions in which to develop. Now, Lenin, in referring to this development, he said that it shows you the enthusiasm of the moment. He said that news of the international and sympathy for it was spreading among the working class of the world. This situation has been brought about by the growth of the proletarian revolution, which is manifestly developing everywhere by leaps and bounds. This was a moment in which revolutions were breaking out everywhere. The perspective was one of extremely optimistic one of the possibility of the German Revolution, the Hungarian Revolution, the Italian Revolution, and spreading beyond, which would have meant the Soviet Union was not going to be isolated, but was going to spread and to the advanced capitalist countries, which would have changed the whole of history. If you think about it, we would not have had the Nazis. We would not have had the concentration camps. We wouldn't have had the Second World War. We wouldn't have had the crash of 29. We'd have had 100 years of socialist planning, and you can imagine where we would be today if that had happened. A very different situation for humanity. Instead, of course, and I will explain what happened, it didn't achieve that because of the degeneration, the defeats of the revolutions in several countries and then the subsequent degeneration. Now, Lenin referred to the Second International as having grown in sort of in breadth, but lost something in depth, i.e. it became widespread and big, but it lost its cutting edge of theory and understanding. Now, I'll skip over that. As the International was launched, a process was taking place within a lot of the mass social democratic parties, with left currents within them, products of the pre-revolutionary and revolutionary situations that broke out. And it was through those processes that mass splits developed, and from which the mass communist parties were to develop. That in itself is a history, is a lesson of history, how we can envisage things developing in the future. Not exactly the same. History never repeats itself exactly in the same way, as they say, but often it rhymes. It's similar. There are similar processes. The extreme degeneration of the social democracy today means that it's not automatic that you're just going to have the masses turning to them and a left wing develops and we intervene just like the communists did in 1918-20. In Britain, we have elements of it. Thanks to the comrade who brought me the coffee. I don't want it to go cold. He called me sir yesterday. I think next time I'm going to shave my beard, dye my hair, so you call me comrade. Anyway, I got distracted there. Yes, not exactly the same. In Britain, we have elements of this, and it could repeat itself in some countries. In others, we're seeing others, but I don't want to open that discussion. The main thing is the masses move through mass organizations of one kind or another, and then contradictions develop within that. You have left wings developing, you have opposition. As the class struggle intensifies, that develops. And we as Marxists have got to know how to be flexible and how to be in the right place at the right time. Now, an example of this is Italy. The Italian Socialist Party had 60,000 members in 1918. By 1920, just within 2 years, its membership had gone up to about 210,000. The main trade union, led by the Socialists, had 250,000 members in 1918, 2,100,000 in 1920. That shows you this ballooning of the mass organizations of the working class. What the Socialist Party of 1920 was not the same party as 1918. 2/3 of its membership was new, and mainly young workers that were radicalized by the crisis, by the war, and you had the occupation of the factories in 1920, where workers took over the factories and ran them themselves. You had the Red Guards in Turin, the peasants were occupying the land. The Italian working class in September 1920 could have taken power. That's the reality of the situation. Actually, the conditions were more favorable than in Russia. The working class was actually stronger numerically. The weakness was in its leadership. But the radicalization of the Socialist Party pushed it so far to the left, at least in words, that I don't know if you're aware of the fact, the Italian Socialist Party joined the Third International en bloc. And they even integrated into the party symbol the hammer and sickle, which survived until the 1970s. I remember when I joined the Italian Socialist Party for a few years, we did some work there. The symbol of the party was a nice symbol. It was the open book of knowledge, the rising sun of socialism, and on top, the hammer and sickle. And it dates from that period. But the point is, the whole party joined. The left wing, the centrists, and the right-wing reformists. It was necessary to have some clarification. What happened was that the Socialist Party de facto betrayed the movement of 1920, and in January 1921, at the National Congress of the party, it split in two. Delegates representing about 1/3 of the membership walked out of the conference hall, moved to a local theatre in Livorno, in Tuscany, and founded the Communist Party of Italy as a section of the Comintern. And it came from the left wing. The youth, this is always the case, generally speaking in these processes, you saw the youth wings of the social democracy en masse joining the communist parties. They took all the youth. The youth are always the more revolutionary layer of the parties. In some countries, it was the youth that became the basis of the new party. As in many other countries, the Italian Socialist Party emerged, the Italian Communist Party, emerged under an ultra-left leadership. They drew all the wrong conclusions. Bordiga was the general secretary of the party, a revolutionary, but ultra-left in question of tactics. He rejected the United Front, etc. I'll go into that a bit later on. Therefore, they actually, in a second moment, contributed to further weakening the working class because Mussolini, in 1919, set up his party, but it was only in 1921 that he started to become strong after the defeat of the working class, and in 1922 organized his famous March on Rome when the king handed over to him the job of organizing a government. In the rise of fascism, there was an instinctive coming together of the youth of the various parties, the young socialists, the young republicans, etc., and they set up an organization called the Arditi del Popolo, which is like the courageous of the people, roughly translated, which were anti-fascist bodies. The young communists were instinctively joining. Bordiga and the leadership of the party pulled them back and said, no, either with the communists or against the communists, in a very ultra-left way, further dividing and weakening the working class. That's what sectarianism does in a moment like that. And this wasn't just isolated to Italy. The ultra-leftism infected many of the communist parties. The Communist International was not born as a pure, clear Marxist organization with a clear understanding of tactics, etc. It was a revolutionary international that looked to the Russian Revolution, but was young and inexperienced and hadn't been through all the periods of building the Bolshevik Party and all the lessons that the Bolsheviks drew from their own experience. For instance, the United Front tactic was ABC to the Bolsheviks. It wasn't ABC to Bordiga and many of the leaders of the other communist parties. In Germany, the roots of the Communist Party lie in the opposition within the social democracy around Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. Karl Liebknecht, who the first time round actually voted for the war credits, but then realized his mistake and opposed. And then there was a growing opposition to the war within the social democracy. And by 1917, there was a split in the SPD around the USPD, the Independent Social Democracy, and the Spartacist group around Rosa Luxemburg and Liebknecht eventually became the leadership of that formation. A further split clarified, and it's from within this that the German Communist Party emerged on the back of the German Revolution. We've discussed this before, so I don't want to go into the details for lack of time, but we have the Hungarian Communist Party, which initially started with very small forces of cadres in Moscow, but very quickly developed into a mass force and actually formed a government in 1919. There is a long text on the website about the Hungarian Revolution written by Alan Woods, which I'd invite you to read if you want to understand what happened there and the mistakes that were made there. In France, the Socialist Party, which was called the SFIO, the Section Française de l'Internationale Ouvrière, the French section of the Workers' International, they actually, by a majority vote in 1920 at the Congress of Tours, decided to change their name to Communist Party and adhere to the Third International. So it was the majority in France. The minority split away and kept the old name and remained as the Socialist Party. But because of the way it was born, there was a lot of opportunists were in the Communist Party itself. The British Communist Party was a very different story. It was not, it didn't originate in a mass split, but in several small groups that came together to fuse into one group. One of them was the British Socialist Party, another one was the Communist Unity Group of the Socialist Labour Party, the South Wales Socialist Society. These various groupings, small groups, came together with the idea of forming a Communist Party, but they had internal friction and debate because some of them rejected the United Front and some of them accepted it. In fact, it was in these conditions that Lenin wrote Left-Wing Communism, an Infantile Disorder, because what he saw was this ultra-leftism was the sickness of being very young. That's why he called it an infantile disorder, i.e., you'll grow up, you'll mature, and you'll understand the real position of the communists and the tactics that they need to apply. So they came together, and it's interesting, I will read it later on, because the advice that Lenin gives the British communists as a small group is to actually join the Labour Party. Now, when you get attacked by all these sects who say, what are your comrades in Britain doing? You know, well, we're doing what Lenin advised us to do. What are you doing? Now, the Communist Party of Poland, shortly afterwards, around about 1920, you have the formation of the Communist Party of India. They have, in Brazil, real revolutionary events in 1917 with the cannons being fired on working class neighborhoods. It was in those conditions that a Communist Party emerged. They set up a Latin American bureau to build communist parties in South America. In Spain, initially, the Communist Party started off as a very small group of about 5,000 in 1922, but infected with ultra-leftism, the Communist Party of Spain actually got a mass base. This is nothing to do with the first four congresses. In the 1930s, actually, when the young socialists of the Socialist Party were so radicalized that they actually turned to the Fourth International and invited them to join and help to Bolshevize them. And if they had done that, the Spanish Trotskyists would have had a mass base. Instead, sectarians, they refused. The Stalinists were not so stupid. They won over the leadership of the Spanish Young Socialists and created the base, a mass base for the Communist Party, which of course was a Stalinist party, which contributed to the defeat of the Spanish Revolution. But going back to the congresses of the Comintern, the first Congress really was an announcement of the International, the manifesto and the general principles, and then it started to spread. The second, third, and fourth are really treasure houses of theory and debate. Sometimes we have debates about questions. You go here and you say, what are we discussing this? It's already been solved. Why reinvent the wheel? Most of the questions that we need to look at were debated here in these congresses, and we should study them. They're all available on the internet. the key documents, let's say, are available. And for instance, at the Second Congress, they discussed the national and colonial question. It's interesting. What was the position of a lot of the leaders of the Second International? Well, they thought that colonialism was progressive because it was civilizing the colonial peoples. That was how, because they had this distorted view that, you see, the development of productive forces is progressive. Capitalism is progressive, which is true. Historically speaking, it's true, because it builds the productive forces and raises human technique to a higher level. But then they took from that this formalistic position that then when they colonize Africa and America and the rest of it, they're bringing civilization. That's how they saw it. It's amazing how far they went on this. But they didn't really develop a position. They didn't even really look at the situation in the colonial countries. They looked at Europe and North America mainly. The Third International is very different. It treats the colonial question in a serious way and looks to the rising revolt of the colonial peoples. And it started to develop a class outlook on this question. I'll quote from the draft theses on the national question. It says that the Communist Party, as the avowed champion of the proletarian struggle to overthrow the bourgeois yoke, must base its policy in the national question too. This is on the national question, not on the colonial. Not on abstract and formal principles, but first on a precise appraisal of the specific historical situation and primarily of economic conditions. Second, on a clear distinction between the interests of the oppressed classes of working and exploited people and the general concept of national interest as a whole, which implies the interests of the ruling class. Third, on an equally clear distinction between the oppressed, dependent, and subject nations and the oppressing, exploited, and sovereign nations. This is how they saw the relationship with the imperialist countries and the colonized countries. But as you see, there's always a class distinction. And they raise the idea that the working class must take power everywhere. It's interesting how they look at this question. When they talk about petty bourgeois nationalism, they say that it preserves national self-interest intact, whereas proletarian internationalism demands, first, that the interests of the proletarian struggle in any one country should be subordinated to the interests of that struggle on a world scale. You don't limit yourself only to appraising the national position, but you see how it contributes to enhancing the world struggle for socialism. They say the Communist parties must assist the bourgeois democratic liberation movement in these countries. They're talking about the colonial countries. And the duty of rendering the most active assistance rests primarily with the workers of the country the backward nation is colonially or financially dependent on. So what they say is, we are for the liberation of the colonies, and the working class of the oppressor nation has a duty to aid the peoples of the colonial countries in liberating themselves. At a certain point, they raise the idea of an alliance with the bourgeois democrats in the colonial countries. You see how this changes actually from in the course of the congresses. To begin with, they say the Communist International must enter into a temporary alliance with bourgeois democracy in the colonial and backward countries, because they saw it as the beginnings of a bourgeois democratic revolution, and therefore we've got to assist that in taking place, which is more or less the position Marx had in the 1840s in Germany, where capitalism hadn't yet been established. The bourgeoisie wasn't in power. But then they add, but should not merge with it and should under all circumstances uphold the independence of the proletarian movement. Later on, I will show you how that actually evolves. Again, on the national question, this is from the report on the party program at the 8th Congress of the Russian Communist Party in 1919, where Lenin refers to this. He's critical of Bukharin, who talks about self-determination only for the workers. And Lenin says that's ridiculous because if you're calling for self-determination of nations, it's the whole nation in its identity. And of course, it means all the different classes. And then he gives the example of what happened in Finland, because he says the Finns have experienced the dictatorship of Germany. They are now experiencing the dictatorship of the Allied powers. But thanks to the fact that we have recognized the right of nations to self-determination, the process of differentiation has been facilitated. He pointed out that because the Bolsheviks were insisting on the right of nations to self-determination, which in itself was not, let's be clear on this, it was not that the aim was to separate all countries. The aim was to remove a barrier between the working people of the oppressed nation and the working people of the oppressor nation, i.e., the Russian working class is different from the landlords and the bourgeoisie. We have no interest in oppressing the Finns. We're prepared to concede independence if you so wish. By doing that, they point out, they say that the bourgeoisie were deceiving the people, were deceiving the working people by alleging that the Muscovites, the chauvinists, the great Russians, wanted to crush the Finns. We had to concede self-determination, and by doing so, he says, the differentiation within Finland began, i.e., you remove this from the equation, and you're left with a Finnish working class facing its class enemy, and the class differentiation began. There's a text by Lenin in 1913, it's called Backward Europe and Advanced Asia, which is interesting to read, because he refers to the rising movement of the peoples of the colonial countries. At the Second Congress, the national question is discussed in the fourth session, again, Lenin, in his speech, he emphasizes the difference between the oppressed and oppressor nations, and they start to move away from the idea of the bourgeois democratic term. They say, they discussed it, and they said this was the point that gave rise to some differences of opinion when they were discussing the theses. We debated whether it is correct in principle and theoretically to declare the Communist International and the Communist parties have a duty to support the bourgeois democratic movements in the backward countries. And the outcome of this discussion was that we came to the unanimous decision to talk not about the bourgeois democratic movement, but only about the national revolutionary movement. They're moving away from the idea that the bourgeois in these countries could play a progressive and even revolutionary role. In effect, they're adopting Trotsky's position on the permanent revolution. They stress that, and we should use these theses to show, because often they try and say, well, Lenin had a position, Trotsky had a different one. The theses here, these really belong to Lenin and Trotsky together. They had unity of understanding on this. But they went even further. Later on in the same theses, it says, after saying the proletariat in the advanced countries can and must help the backward laboring masses, they say this. The question was this: can we accept as correct the idea that the capitalist development of the economy is necessary for those backward peoples who are now liberating themselves, and among whom now, following the war, progressive movements have developed? I.e., do we support the movement towards capitalism in these countries? It says, if the victorious revolutionary proletariat organizes systematic propaganda and the Soviet government come to its assistance with every means at its disposal, it is correct to assume that the capitalist stage of development, it is incorrect to assume that the capitalist stage of development is necessary for such peoples. It's very clear. They're saying that you don't have to have a capitalist stage of development in the colonial countries. And it's here, in black and white, at the Second Congress of the Communist International at its fourth session. So it's, as I said, it's a treasure trove of theory, and it's also something we can use to throw back at the Stalinists themselves. It says further on, the struggle to overthrow foreign domination in the colonies does not therefore mean underwriting the national aims of the national bourgeoisie, but much rather smoothing the path to liberation for the proletariat of the colonies. And then it says, in this way, the masses of the people in the backward countries will be brought to communism, not by capitalist development, but by the development of class consciousness under the leadership of the proletariat of the advanced countries. That's how they viewed the colonial revolution. And I'd invite you to read them all, these theses, study them, take them on board. I have to move ahead because of time. They also discussed the question of the trade unions, and they defined the trade unions thus. The trade unions proved to be, in most cases during the war, a part of the military apparatus of the bourgeoisie, helping the latter to exploit the working class as much as possible. The unions betrayed not only the cause of the social revolution, but even also the struggle for the improvement of the conditions of life of the workmen organized by them. And they talk about an amicable arrangement with the capitalists that they organized. Now, you would think that therefore they'd be calling for a break, but they don't. They say the exact opposite. They say that in spite of this bureaucratic nature of the unions, it says the wider masses of workers who until now have stood apart from the labor unions are now flowing into their ranks in a powerful stream. Remember what I said about Italy, 1918 to 20. In all capitalist countries, a tremendous increase of the trade unions is to be noticed, which now become organizations of the chief masses of the proletariat, not only of its advanced elements. But then he talks about the old bureaucracy resisting, etc. But it says specifically, the communists must join such unions in all countries. It doesn't say break away, it says the opposite. It says all voluntary withdrawals from the industrial movement, every artificial attempt to organize special unions, etc., represents a great danger to the communist movement. It threatens to hand over the most advanced, the most conscious workers to the opportunist leaders, playing into the hands of the bourgeoisie. This is the position of the Comintern on the trade unions, and it is the idea that we have inherited and defend. At the same time, they weren't rigid. There were moments in which there were splits. Mass splits took place in spite of the communists. What do communists do in such circumstances? Do they lecture to these advanced workers, or do they go with them? It says, where a split between the opportunists and the revolutionary trade union movement has already taken place, the communists are bound to support such revolutionary unions. You would think they're saying the opposite of what they were saying before. It's simply a question, you go with the work, you go with the masses. It says, where within the trade unions or outside of them organizations are formed in the factories, such as shop stewards, factory committees, for the purpose of fighting against the counter-revolutionary tendencies of the trade unions, bureaucracy, the communists must, with all their energy, give assistance to these organizations. So you see, and we actually published these theses in Italy as a pamphlet, all of them, because we faced the situation. I'll give you a concrete example. In the 1980s, the Italian train drivers, 90% of them walked out en masse from the trade unions because they were blocking them in their negotiations. And they set up the rank and file committees, which became the trade union of the train drivers. Now, what was our position? We didn't go there and say, haven't you read thesis number 2 of the Comintern? We went there and we participated. We only had one train driver at the time. I remember interviewing them and discussing with them. But what we pointed out was the perspective of class struggle, because they became very limited in their outlook, looking only at the train drivers. And we said, you've got to think of the rest of the workforce. In fact, the tactics of the bosses were provoke the train drivers and then defeat them in the course of struggle because they were the most advanced layer. They did that. They were demoralized. Then they started attacking other sections of the railway workers. And when that happened, the train drivers said, well, they didn't strike for us. Why would she strike for them? And the bosses won. And the result was a huge victory for the bosses. So you have to have a flexible approach. And it's all there in the trade union theses, which come up again later on. There was a thesis on the Communist International and the Red International of Trade Unions. This was in the Third Congress in 1921, where in several countries there had been mass splits. Sometimes those splits were provoked by the bureaucracy itself in an attempt to isolate the more advanced layers, just like they did in Italy. They literally provoked the train drivers. I remember what they did. It was disgusting, the things they did, even in the little details. But it was a conscious effort. Because the bourgeois need to control the trade unions, and they refer to this idea, which is often spread by the trade union leaders, of so-called apolitical trade unions, that neutral trade unions. Neutral trade unions means trade unions which ally with the bosses. And here's a quote, which it's from 1921, but you tell me if this isn't valid today. In order to maintain its rule and squeeze surplus value from the workers, the bourgeoisie needs not only the priest, the policeman, the general, and the informer, but also the trade union bureaucrat and the kind of workers, in inverted commas, leader that teaches trade unionists the virtue of neutrality and non-participation in political struggle. This is a very good description of the American trade union bureaucrats of today, and also the Europeans, etc. In spite of this, they still say the principal position taken by the Communist International on the participation of communists in the trade union movement. It says communists must explain to the proletariat that their problems can be answered not by leaving the old trade unions for new ones or by staying outside the unions, but by revolutionizing the trade unions, ridding them of reformist influence and the treacherous reformist leaders, and transforming them into a genuine stronghold of the revolutionary proletariat. It says the objective is to win the majority of the workers organized in the trade unions, and the communists must not be discouraged by the present reactionary mood of the labor unions. The theses are permeated with this idea. At the same time, they said they should be open to the revolutionary syndicalists who are outside of the historical trade unions, and that's in France. In America, they actually say, here it says, talking about the United States at the time, the same revolutionary process is occurring in America, though more slowly. It's historical characteristic. Communists must on no account leave the ranks of the reactionary Federation of Labor. It says, composed in the main of skilled workers. On the contrary, they should seek to gain a foothold in the old trade unions with the aim of revolutionizing them. It is vital that they work with the IWW members most sympathetic to the party. This does not, however, preclude arguing against the IWW's political position. So while you stay in the main unions, you're still open to other currents and you try and win them to the party. I don't have time to go into more detail on that, but that's another very important lesson that the communists provided. At a certain point, though, as I said earlier, they had the problem of all the opportunists who were still members of the Comintern, and there was a necessity to clarify who was and who was not a member. And that's why you have the famous 21 conditions, which were voted at the Second Congress. And the 21 conditions established what you had to adhere to if you wanted to be a member of the International. But it's interesting, and even here you have elements of what we've discussed. Sorry. In some of the splits we've had actually in recent periods, in the recent years. For instance, the periodical and other press of each party must be subordinated to the party leadership. None of this editorial boards which are autonomous from the leadership. All the organs of propaganda must be under the control of the elected leadership of the organization. Another demand, too, was to remove the reformists and centrists. They had to be expelled. They had to be purged from the organization. Another one was no trust in bourgeois legality, combined legal and illegal activity. This was obviously according to the conditions of the country. It raised the need for systematic propaganda within the army. It talked about the poorest peasants. It talked about the need to unmask social patriotism. I can't go into the details. I have to be very, very quick. On the colonies, it said it called for an end for the colonies, obviously, to supporting every liberation movement in the colonies, in the trade unions, building cells within all the unions. Members of parliament and public representatives must be under the discipline of the party as a whole through its leadership. Democratic centralism was emphasized in a centralist manner as possible. That's how the party should be organized. If iron discipline reigns within it, if the party center sustained by the confidence of the party membership is endowed with the fullest rights and authority and the most far-reaching powers, i.e., once you've had your democratic discussion and elected a leadership, that is the leading body of the organization and it has far-reaching powers, as they say. And then they say, from time to time, it's necessary to undertake purges. Now don't worry, they're not talking about concentration camps. In bracket, it's explained, re-registration of the membership of their party organizations in order to cleanse the party systematically of the petty bourgeois elements within it, i.e. a constant battle to remove those elements that tended to drift in an opportunist direction and maintain the revolutionary character of the organization. Then they referred to international control. Each party, this is not a federation of separate parties. It's one world party, and each national party, adhering to the Communist International, was under the discipline of the International. And also to maintain a clear identity, etc. I can't say all of them, but point 21, which apparently was insisted by Bordiga, those party members who fundamentally reject the conditions and theses laid down by the Communist International are to be expelled from the party. You don't get expelled simply for this minor detail or whatever. If you don't agree with the fundamental principles of the international organization, you cannot be a member of the organization. Otherwise, you have the same process that took place with the Second International. In the Third Congress, they had a long debate on the question of women and the work amongst women. And it says, the Third Congress there, all communist parties of the West and East need to increase work amongst female proletariat. It goes into the question quite in detail. It says, it talks about the enormous danger presented to the revolution by the masses of passive working women who are outside the movement. The housewives, office workers, and peasant women who are still under the influence of the bourgeois worldview, and therefore the need to win over the working women. And it says, it follows that the communist parties must extend their influence over the widest layer of the female population by means of organizing special apparatuses inside the party and establishing special methods of approaching women. This is particularly the case in the conditions of the backward countries, where even today we have some countries where women are not allowed to be in the same room as men. If you go to some parts of northern Nigeria or Pakistan or Afghanistan or other countries, it literally is impossible for a man to recruit a woman. And therefore you have to have special measures to educate the women that you have, and then they have to do the work of penetrating the women. But it emphasizes that the emancipation of working women can only come through communism. It says the working women of the whole world, that their liberation from centuries of enslavement, lack of rights and inequality is possible, and this is emphasized in italics, only through the victory of communism. And it continues. There is no special women's question, i.e. separate from the working class, nor should there be a special women's movement, and that any alliance between working women and bourgeois feminism or support for the vacillating or clearly right-wing tactics of the social compromisers and opportunists will lead to the weakening of the forces of the proletariat. A communist society will be won not by the united efforts of women of different classes, but by the united struggle of all the exploited, i.e. working women and working men, not working women and bourgeois women. The Third Congress of the Communist International warns working women against any kind of cooperation or agreement with bourgeois feminists. This runs through the whole thesis. At the same time, it emphasizes the need for special apparatus and methods, etc. But it raises the question that the schools on the women's question shouldn't be just for women. All party members, men and women, must be educated in the women's question. That's the way they pose it. In practice, we had women's journals being produced, winning over working class women, and you also see, historically, women in normal conditions, because especially in the more backward countries, less developed, and even in the capitalist countries, the advanced countries, if we look at the past, men tended to go out to work, women were isolated to their home, and this tended to they had a lower consciousness on the question of class struggle. But once the movement took off, in all of the revolutions you see, these women who are supposedly more backward leap even over the heads of the men and become the most advanced. And you see that in all the revolutionaries. In the Third Congress, they also discussed the question of the communist youth. They highlighted the greater radicalization of the youth. But again, no separate political existence. A youth organization, yes, but not a separate organization. Otherwise, you'd have two parties. The youth is under the discipline of the party as a whole. But as I said before, they struggled in these congresses. If you read them carefully, you will notice that Lenin didn't go in there, and simply because Lenin spoke, everybody voted in favor. You had Bordiga from the Italian. You had the German ultralefts. You had the Dutch, Goethe, Pannekoek. You had, in Britain, you had the ultralefts. It wasn't just this or that small group. There was a significant layer of the international which had been won over to revolutionary politics, but they had an ultra-left approach. They had an infantile approach to this question. Now, how did Lenin and Trotsky solve this? You see, whereas they were very determined and firm about the centrists and the reformists, they need to be expelled, purged. When it came to the ultra-left, they didn't have that approach. They regarded them as comrades that needed to be educated and won over. And you see that in the debates in the congresses, Lenin and Trotsky intervene, not by giving orders, but by going through historical experience, explaining themselves through facts, through arguments, and they won the debate. They won the debate on this question. They didn't convince everybody, but gradually they did win them over to the correct policy, which was, for example, the United Front. Compare that to our friends in the CWI who claim to be Leninists and Trotskyists. How do they solve differences? They don't try and win over through debate. They immediately go for a split, which is absolutely crazy. At one point, Lenin was even in favor of keeping an open door to the Worker Communist Party of Germany, which was the ultra-left split from the Communist Party, because he considered them revolutionary communists who were making mistakes and needed to be won over. You don't do that by command. You do that by the authority of individuals like Lenin and Trotsky and debate. Now, why was the United Front such an important tactic at this particular moment? Because you see, we go from the period of 1917-19, which was one of the revolutionary offensive. Revolutions were breaking out everywhere. It looked like the working class was on the verge of taking power in one country after another. The weaknesses, the mistakes, sometimes ultra-left mistakes, led to a defeat of several revolutions. And by 1921, it had become clear that the offensive was halting. It was slowing down, and capitalism was restabilizing itself. It had gained its feet again after being shaken by the movement that followed the First World War. Germany, the revolution had receded. Hungary, it had been defeated. Italy, it had been defeated. Counter-revolution was beginning to rise its head. And if you read Trotsky in the 1921 Congress, where he talks about how also there was an economic recovery taking place. This was the beginning of the booming 20s, particularly in the United States, but also elsewhere. A combination of the defeats of a number of revolutions, restabilization, and a certain boom in the economy created new conditions. The revolutionary offensive was off the agenda, and therefore it was a question of how do you win the masses? And at the Fourth Congress, they rediscussed the question of the trade unions. Similar conclusions were drawn, working inside them, how to expose the reformists, not splitting the unions, etc. In Britain, again, if the Spartacists ever come up to you and annoy you, and they've annoyed me a few times, and I tell them where to go, I use two good Anglo-Saxon words. One has 4 letters, the other has 3. And it begins with an F, just in case you didn't get it. On the British Labour Party, this is the theses of the Fourth Congress, 1922. The British communists must launch a vigorous campaign for their admittance to the Labour Party. In the other countries where the communist parties were bigger, they were mass forces, they had to apply the tactic of the United Front. In Italy, for instance, the communists split as a minority. Trotsky pointed out, Bordiga said either with us or against us. He was a sectarian. Trotsky pointed out, you took 60,000 members, but there's 100,000 members who belong to the centrist faction of the Socialist Party who still believe they want to be in the Third International, but they haven't understood. They don't understand the Communist Party. You have to win them over. How? By applying the United Front. What is the United Front? You offer unity to the Socialist Party. You don't say, you're traitors, we won't work with you. Especially with the rise of fascism, you offer a united anti-fascist front in struggle, and that's the way to expose the leaders of the Socialist Party. If they refuse that offer, they're exposed in the eyes of the best Socialist Party workers. If they accept, then they have to show their ability to struggle day by day. And the communists in the day-to-day struggles will show their superiority and win over the ranks of the Socialist Party. That means a period of winning the masses was necessary. That was why they developed the United Front. And in effect, I haven't got time to go into the details. I invite you to read them. They're called the Theses on the United Front, adopted by the Executive Committee in December 1922. Entrism is nothing but an extension of the United Front when you are very small. That's why in Britain, they didn't say United Front. They say you must campaign to join the Labour Party because it was a small force. And the Fourth Congress really was dominated by this question of the tactics they needed to adopt to win over the workers who followed the reformists. They also established the idea of international discipline. He says, now more than ever, the strictest international discipline is necessary both within the Communist International and in each of its separate sections in order to carry out the United Front tactic at the international level and in each individual country. And they reiterated the need to accept the 21 points. Now, you had the ultra-lefts. A guy called Goethe actually replied to left-wing communism. It's available if you look it up. Hermann Goethe. He opposed participating in the elections. He was for splitting the unions. And he accused Lenin of opportunism for advocating parliamentary work and work in the trade unions. Lenin was actually defined as being on the right wing of the International. And Lenin once jokes about it. You know, obviously, if I'm to they're ultra-left, they're to my left, I'm on the right. But in the context of the Communist International, it doesn't really mean much. Now, the parties, as I said, suffered from ultra-leftism as a reaction, a healthy reaction against the betrayal of the reformists. They saw these as treacherous traitors and had to be fought. They didn't understand that you've got to actually win the workers who look to these leaders. And if you look at it and you read left-wing communism and all the rest of the texts that are available here, you'll see that the method of the IMT is not against the traditions of Lenin and Trotsky. We are, in actual fact, the only tendency which genuinely preserves this tradition and this method if you read the theses. And if you see the role of Trotsky, Trotsky comes out brilliantly in these congresses, in the speeches and the texts that he writes at that time. And I would invite you to read them. His texts are gathered in the 2 volumes of the first 5 years of the Communist International. And he deals with all these questions. He deals, for instance, with the example of what would the effect of a boom be. He deals with the question of the relationship between economic cycles and class struggle. Does a slump mean immediate class struggle? He points out that not necessarily. And he draws that lesson from the experience of the Russian movement, where sometimes a deep slump can actually dampen the class struggle because it's obvious. If the boss is about to sack people or there's no work, a strike doesn't have the same impact. The workers have their heads down. A revival in the economy can encourage the workers to come out because they feel stronger, because the boss needs to produce, and that's when they can hit the boss. And in Volume 2, there's the text, The School of Revolutionary Strategy, which I would strongly advise the comrades to read. I've gone over my time, so I have to really rapidly go through the rest. Trotsky's advice to the French communists is something you should read. What's happening to capitalism? Is it developing the productive forces or not? He actually says it was in the 1920s. I'll run through that, and that I've mentioned. The first 4 congresses, 1919 to 1922, we recognize as ours. I've only been able to rapidly go through the main points that were discussed. But the subsequent congresses, and you notice something, whereas 1919, 1920, 1921, 1922, every year, in the middle of a civil war, in the middle of all the difficulties they had annual congresses that went on for weeks where they discussed and deliberated, because Lenin and Trotsky understood the need to educate the leaderships of the communist parties in order to succeed in the revolution, particularly in Germany. The next Congress is 1924, the 5th. The next one after that is 1928, the 6th. And the next one, 1935, the 7th. These are Stalinist shows. They are no longer genuine congresses. And in 1943, they dissolve the Communist International as a gesture to their bourgeois allies, the Americans, the British, to show them that they were not interested in the revolution, confirming what the Trotsky had said, the nationalist degeneration of the communist parties. They were no longer interested in world revolution, but simply preserving their position as bureaucrats. At the time, Ted Grant wrote a text, The Rise and Fall of the Communist International, published in June 1943, and he starts thus: the Third International has been officially buried in the most undignified, uncontemptible fashion it would be possible to conceive. It has passed off the stage of history, hurriedly and without consultation, etc. Just signed off the death certificate of the Comintern. Now, that's what the Stalinists did with the Communist International. I don't have time to go into that in detail. But as you see, the United Front, the trade unions, the women's question, the youth question, the national question, the colonial question, and theoretical issues in general are all discussed at a very high level in these congresses, and they are the heritage that we defend. And we should study those texts, organize discussions like the one we're having here. The World School will be dedicated to this question, and use it to explain what kind of organization we aspire to building. It will be a mass revolutionary international, which will come from processes within the existing labor movement as it is, and the contradictions which will emerge under the pressure of events as the crisis of capitalism deepens, as the class struggle evolves. This will inevitably produce shifts to the left, either currents within the existing parties or the emergence of new ones, such as Mélenchon's movement in France, or Podemos partially in Spain, although they're cutting across that because of their own reformism. But we see everywhere indications of this. Even Sanders is, to a degree, an expression of this process in the United States. He wouldn't exist if there wasn't a radicalization within the American working class. It's early days. How it's going to unfold, what is going to emerge. Is it going to be a party that's created by the trade unions? Well, with these trade union bureaucrats as they stand, that's going to take a bit of time. It could emerge as a political force from other developments, but something from somewhere is going to come. We're not in the business of crystal ball gazing and looking at the details, but some kind of mass force of the American workers will emerge at some stage. We don't know exactly how the currents will develop, but it's there. We've got to educate our comrades on that and be prepared to intervene. You see the lessons of history. The revolutionary Marxists can sometimes lose opportunities, and if you lose an opportunity, you're not going to get a second chance very quickly. It can then prepare a defeat of the working class. So we're preparing to intervene in those processes, and the lessons of the Third International are precious in educating our comrades in how to do this and what our aims are.